So I just watched part of the 4-hour long live stream of Sargon's conversation with the White Nationalists. I didn't see the whole thing, but it's actually kind of interesting how this topic is now popping up again. It was a huge thing a few years ago, and then it died down a bit. But now it is apparently resurfacing, thanks to XJWs. So this guy, Millennial Will, seems like a reasonable guy. But I simply think that he's either not wise enough to think clearly about what he actually believes, or he's misinformed. I'm hoping this is going to be a quick video, but I just want to address a few of the things that he said. So first of all, as a Chinese American, I have the following thing to say regarding what he said about why aren't the Chinese taking in immigrants and why are they so conformist even though they have higher IQs than the whites on the average. I just want to point out that this whole line of thinking is kind of typical of a sort of a double standard on the white nationalist part, from what I encountered. And this double standard is, look, there are racial differences in average IQ, which would explain why the Western Europeans got so much ahead of everybody else. Oh, but what about the Asians who have even higher IQ? Well, then there are other factors too, such as they're not creative or they're too conformist. That's their handicap. Oh, but you're not applying that to the Europeans, are you? Well, the fact of the matter is, there's currently no convincing evidence that IQ has been selected purely based on either skin color or continent population clusterings. Every explanation that has been put forth has been debunked in one way or another. There might be IQ differences among different specific populations of people, but I'm not currently convinced that you can largely make a sweeping generalization that this whole continent of people are selected with lower IQ than this other whole continent of people, and that's due to evolution of genes by natural selection of some sort. The history of Asia is drastically different from the history of the Western Europeans. Relatively speaking, Asia is more homogeneous than Europe. There are currently 48 countries in Asia with a total population of 4.27 billion people. There are currently 50 countries in Europe with only a total population of 742.5 million. I looked up how many ethnic groups there are in Europe, and Wikipedia gives me a total of 87, so 33 major population with at least one sovereign state and 54 minority ones. Now I tried to look up how many total there are in Asia, and I can't find a solid number, but just by counting from the Wikipedia page, the major ethnic groups are 12 plus 4 plus 8 plus 11, so 35 out of billions of people. So you can see that Europe, relatively speaking, is simply more diverse, and it has been throughout history due to its lack of long-term sustained empires. Again, I'm talking about relative terms. For example, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire only lasted for less than 100 years. And even the Roman Empire lasted for 500 years in the West and about 1,000 years in the East. China, for example, had an empire, if you start with the first imperial dynasty until the fall of Imperial China, for over 2,000 years. It just kept growing and growing until it is the country it is today. All of this means that Europeans simply had to deal with more foreign treaties and just more foreigners in general, and more diversity than the Chinese had to deal with historically. So to give an example, all of Europeans' monarchs, they have lines from many countries because they intermarried between countries. The Chinese emperor, on the other hand, largely married within the family. It is a polygynous culture, but you still, relatively very few of the wives are of a foreign blood. So it's not that Europeans are more altruistic, they are just more used to more diversity. The aristocratic Europeans spoke more foreign languages than the educated Chinese aristocratic family. And it's also more prevalent that they spoke more foreign languages. So this means that the homogeneity in China would inevitably contribute to people being more conformist. I mean, how can you be individualistic when everybody around you look and behave very similar to you? And that you rarely encounter any foreigner, not to mention any foreigner that look drastically different enough from you that they stand out to you. The second point would be that the white nationalists tend to bring on this chicken or egg problem, right? They claim that, well, the reason why Europe didn't have a sustainable homogeneous empire for a long time is because of their innate individualism. Although, of course, this claim cannot be proved either way. We just don't have conclusive genes for individualism to pinpoint as far as I know. But this is simply making an unfounded assumption. Europe was in the Dark Ages for about 9 centuries. I mean, if they were truly altruistic or individualistic, then surely they would not ended up adopting a religion that is more tribalistic than any of the major Asian religions. I mean, if you simply study Taoism, which preceded Confucianism, as mentioned, that was the state religion in China for many centuries, and it is one of the most altruistic religion there is, certainly one of the most altruistic major religions. I mean, there's simply no tribal mentality like that of Christianity. And I mean, this might be one of the reasons why it never had a powerful church like the Catholic Church, since Taoism is not about meddling with worldly things. I tend to believe that one of the major reasons for why Europe was able to reach enlightenment was precisely because it had a long, dark age. I mean, there's a saying that things always have to get worse before it gets better again. Because this is the people's psychology, the people's mentality, which is if something isn't completely broken, then why would I want to make it better? Why spend the effort? The dark religious ages of Europe had a reverse psychological effect on people. That, they say you can't touch a lot of books, actually. A lot of knowledge were forbidden or banned, and they were saying that these knowledges are sinful. So guess what people eventually did? Which is, of course, they can't help their curiosity by looking at them. Whereas in China, yes, there are some books that are banned here and there because they displease the emperor or some sort. But by and large, there are relatively very few. So people were satisfied with the knowledge that they had, and they don't think that they need to look further. So there isn't a pushing force for new heights, and there isn't a competitive pressure for making things better, like in Europe with different countries. And I suspect this is also true of other non-European countries as well. I mean, China had enough to do just to keep and maintain the large empire. The third point that I would like to point out is that this guy that Sargon talked to insisted that whites meant white North and Western Europeans. He specifically pointed these people out. Well, it's interesting because if there truly is a group of people in history that might be born with the smarts, quote unquote, and by this, it just means that a few people who were born with the smarts happen to be of this specific ethnic group, I would say it would be the Greeks, who are certainly not North and Western Europeans. They were really the ones who started everything. All of the major Western principles of reason, science, and government can be traced back to the Greco-Roman philosophies. It was then the Italians who then rediscovered them centuries later and then started the Renaissance, and then the rest of Europe soon followed, leading to the civilized Europe as it is today. So once again, no evidence that any of what Europe's achievement is predominantly because of white North and Western European achievements. Now, all of this leads to the immigration problems of today. And it's been said that Europeans are letting in so many people because of their altruism. Because look, find another non-European nation or nations that are letting in so many people who are so different from them, right? Well, I would like to say, find me another non-European nation or nations that has conquered so many nations with people who are so different from them in the last few centuries. I find this to be inevitably a cause and effect. So when you are a global winner and you have the right tools to make things right, you inevitably start doing it. Winners can't afford to feel sorry for losers, and losers obviously hate the winners. And then when you have a government that uses the situation to gain political power and massively brainwash people of their winner takes all guilt, this is what happens. I don't support mass immigration without filtering. I simply believe that, let's say if history was different, let's say that it was, China, who in the past few centuries conquered Europe, or it was an African country who in the past few centuries conquered Europe and Asia, assuming that they also have the right tools that the European had. And I tend to believe that they do go together, the right tools and success of conquest through technological advances. So if that were the case, you may very well see a mass immigration going on with Europeans going into China. Now, I know at this point somebody would ask, okay, but why did the Europeans come up with the right tools and not everybody else? And I would say that this is rather a naive question because it's making the mistakes of an anthropic principle. So why wouldn't one group from humanity outcompete other groups in various period points in human history? I mean, just think about in a university with different departments, right? You will see that some departments outcompeted every other department in gaining funding, for example. If you take race and ethnicity out of the equation, it is obvious to me that a population of humanity would manage to rise above other populations. By the way, that's not to say that every individual or even majority of the individuals within that population did it. You just really need a few influential people within that group to make the difference. So does that mean higher IQ? No, of course not. Just imagine if there are 5 people having exactly the same IQ, all working in the same lab. It's just so hard to believe that one person out of those 5 would end up having breakthrough discoveries over all other 4. Why does this happen? Well, sometimes just by pure chance it could happen. For example, let's say that all 5 people are trying to make the same discoveries, but one person happened to stay at the right place in the right time. So when that discovery happened, he or she was the one who found it. So then that person makes a discovery, and then of course the person would obviously take the credit, and then that person will win the acknowledgement, and then the name of that person will end up in all the papers, and then getting all the fundings, and then eventually ended up taking all the brightest incoming students, just by pure chance. Just by pure chance, a momentum could happen that would make that one person standing above all else in success. So it's sort of like a pebble can start an avalanche, so to speak. Is it then so difficult to believe that the fact that the Europeans discovered vast majority of the right tools in the past few centuries is simply due to chance of how things turned out in European history? And that they did not do that with some superior IQ or altruism or creativity? I tend to think so. There is simply no reason for me to believe that in the future there simply couldn't be another ethnic group or groups who would become quote-unquote the next Europeans. It might be true that if the whites become the minority or go extinct in the next 50 years, all things will go to shit. But I tend to believe that then the rest of humanity would need to rediscover the accomplishments of the Europeans, or they would perish. as some of my friends tend to believe. So they need to make that choice. The future of humanity need to make that choice. And I think there's a high likelihood that they will. Just as when the Roman Empire fell, most of the Greco-Roman accomplishments were either lost, forgotten, or destroyed. But guess what? 7 centuries approximately later, the non-Roman Europeans rediscovered those knowledge and started all over again. I mean, Europe has not been the beacon of, the right tools for even 7 centuries yet. So who knows what might happen in the next 3 or 4 centuries. History tends to repeat itself. Lastly, I do want to address the point regarding the merit of quote-unquote saving the white race. So many white nationalists have stated that it is the same principle as simply saving an animal species or subspecies for its own sake. They make it sound as if there's an objective justification that, look, people are saving animal species for their own sake, for the sake of diversity or aesthetics, so why not people? I simply reject such principle either way. I simply do not think that it can be an objective ethical principle to save either a human subpopulation or an animal species just for saving's sake. It is completely a subjective one. I mean, we should preserve the natural environment as much as we could because our survival is directly dependent upon it. Just as there are animal species that might directly affect human survival or life quality if they go extinct. But other than that, the rest is subjective. It's about what you personally like, and that's fine. I mean, I'm a cat lover, so there might be a breed of cat that I would feel very, very sad if they go extinct. And if I had money, I might personally try to save it by breeding that breed. But I cannot infringe upon other people's individual rights by forcing other people to breed those cats as well. And yes, there are animal species that I think people are spending way too much resource and effort to attempt to save, such as, speaking for myself as a Chinese, the giant panda. I mean, I'm currently convinced that the major reason why people are doing it, they're spending so much effort on an animal that is so limited in terms of survival skills, is probably because they are just cute. I mean, I cannot find any solid ecological or any other reason why saving a giant panda would directly help human beings to survive better. I mean, I personally like diversity when it comes to human races, so I would also be sad if, let's say, the white population goes extinct, or any other population for that matter. And I'm also somewhat of a Europhile, so I can sympathize. But people's individual rights and choices must be respected first and foremost, above all else. Now, I know at this point, white nationalists would say, well, saving the white race directly affects humanity as a whole because white people are the ones taking up the mantle of the Western European civilization. Which is the best one? Which, if gone, because of population change, would negatively affect everybody. I simply disagree with the high likelihood of this happening, especially if we're looking long term. As I've said, right now in the US, over half of the PhDs are taken by foreigners. And I would say at least half of those foreign PhDs are taken by non-whites, mostly Asians and Middle Easterners, who dominate science and technology fields, the most economic fields. As Sargon had mentioned, most of these Asians and Middle Easterners people are first-generation immigrants. I'm a first generation, well, more like 1.5 generation immigrant, I guess. So obviously, they would not be able to assimilate to the European culture so easily. I mean, it is difficult and it does take time because the cultures are so different. And really the only reason I can see of now why, as generations go on, they would not assimilate still would be the effect and result of the regressives on the left side, who keep perpetuating this white guilt and non-white victimhood, which would separate people, obviously, and would cluster people, and they would not assimilate to each other then. I believe instead that we should build a culture of criticism, where open criticism and desensitization to criticism would become a virtue, and people learning to reason and argue with well-regulated emotion, so to more effectively separate their feelings, their own personal feelings, from the debated or discussed topic at hand. If that were to happen to everybody indiscriminately, people will assimilate and come to reason.